This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets. It was quite the red day as far as the top 40 in South Africa is concerned. It closed nearly 3% lower today, dragged lower in part by a near 4% fall in Naspers. Mining majors, Anglo American, BHP, Implats and Sibanye, they all closed in between 2 to 7% lower. We'll speak about MultiChoice's woes in Nigeria in a bit. It's been slapped with a $4.4 billion tax demand by the country's tax agency, the Federal Inland Revenue Service. The firm, however, says that the demand is based on this unfounded allegation that it has undeclared subscribers in Nigeria. Nonetheless, the market was concerned about it in South Africa. Its shares were down by over 7% in today's session. Here are your headlines tonight. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation signs an agreement to acquire 20% of the Dangote refinery. Ethiopia plans to restructure $1 billion of debt to boost recovery efforts after COVID-19. And China pledges to increase financial support to small and medium-sized enterprises. All right, then let's start the hour in Africa's largest oil producer. The state-owned Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, or NNPC, says it has signed an agreement to acquire a 20% stake in the $19.5 billion Dangote refinery, which is currently under construction in Lagos. That refinery is expected to commence operations next year. As designed, it should be able to process 650,000 barrels of crude every day. With the details, here's CGTN's Teja Patmos.
The NNPC has not disclosed exactly how much the 20% stake it plans to acquire in the 19 billion Dangote refinery would cost, but says it would be worth every penny put into the deal. It also says the borrowing would be on the back of its cash flow on its investments in the refinery, but some analysts have concerns.
I have not seen the repayment schedule for that loan. I have not seen the projections of dividend income from that investment as be able to juxtapose the possibility that the investment will be able to pay back the loan. If the investment will not be able to pay back the loan, then it becomes a problem because it simply means that the government has to look for funding from other sources to pay back that loan. But if it's an investment that is based on sound analysis, and clearly we could see appreciation in the value of the investment, we could see cash flow from dividend payment, and then added to the issue of energy security, then one can understand that.
Besides the issue of profit, the NNPC says its decision to acquire 20% stake in the refinery is based on government policy of acquiring equity stakes in any private refinery with a capacity in excess of 50,000 barrels a day for energy security. The Dangote refinery has the capacity to refine 650,000 barrels of oil per day.
It's very important for the federal government to do what they're doing. I really and fully support it because it's such a strategic investment. We don't want that investment to fail. If you look at the magnitude of it, and if Dangote had to take those horrendous risks just because he had faith in this country, we shouldn't allow his project to fail. So it's very important that the government has stake in it, just to help it stay alive and then to help deal with some of the issues that may arise in the future.
Now, it's not just the NNPC that is eyeing a stake in the Dangote refinery. One of the major petroleum marketing bodies in this country, the Independent Petroleum Marketers Association of Nigeria, says it's in talks with Dangote to acquire a 5% stake in the refinery. So we're likely to see more investors show interest in the refinery in the future, especially when it begins operations next year. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
On to budget issues in Nigeria. The Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed says that the government is working with a crude oil price benchmark of $57 a barrel for its 2022 budget and a crude oil production rate of 1.88 million barrels a day. Now, that's 36% higher than the average production rate that we've seen from Nigeria in May, according to OPEC data. Africa's largest oil exporter is producing around 1.4 million barrels of crude a day, partly as a result of an agreement with OPEC and other oil-producing nations to reduce output collectively. Brent crude, against which Nigeria's oil grades are priced, has gone up by nearly 50% so far this year. It's hovering around $73 to $74 a barrel. So let's bring you up to speed with the latest development from Africa's largest economy. Deji Badmus joins us now live from Lagos. Deji, let's start with that price target, $57 a barrel. Is it thinking in the Federal Finance Ministry that oil prices will eventually trend lower in 2021 into the first half of 2022? And if that's the case, why? What's informing their thinking?
Well, Ramah, let me just explain something. That historically, the government had always budgeted far below the prevailing price in the international market. And what it has done is not in any way unusual. It's what it's always done. And it does this so as to create some kind of buffer now, just in case things either go north or south. And so what the government has done is now that oil is selling for around 77, and budgeting 57, so you have a difference of 20. Now that difference is usually kept in an account called the excess crude account. Usually that account is actually used when, of course, there is any form of revenue shortfall, or if by any chance at all the price of oil suddenly dropped, as we saw in the past. So for the thinking of the government is that, look, prices might actually go up beyond the levels that they are now, and that there's a possibility that it could actually drop, and probably drop to somewhere close to the 57 it has budgeted. Now, usually when you have that kind of situation, what the government does is to revise its benchmark. But then something I also have to tell you, Ramah, is that, look, these figures will still have to get to Parliament, and there's a likelihood Parliament may decide to review it, or probably take it upwards, or bring it down further. We just don't know. But it's just traditional, so to speak, and really not out of place or unusual.
Okay, so the other key assumption here is on the output levels, 1.88 million barrels of crude a day. But the country's output, at least as far as we've seen in May, was under 1.4 million barrels a day. If the country's going to raise that 400,000 barrels a day of extra output, will it do that essentially breaking out of its quota within OPEC, or is that 1.8 million number a combination of crude oil plus condensate production?
Well, the truth is that condensate is not factored into what to Nigeria's OPEC quota. So what we've always had too, it's just the same thing with the price benchmark now. Truth is, the production level, what we are seeing now is actually the oil production level. There's just no way. It's just optimistic. It's what the government has always done. Remember last year, the projection was to do just around 1.9 or so, but at the end of the day, the government didn't meet that target. There's just no way. There's no way the government can meet the target of 1.8. Of course, you talked about the OPEC quota, which pegs Nigeria's production to around 1.43 or so. And in May, the country didn't even meet that 1.43. And sometime in January this year, it was able to do around 1.3 something. So that's a fairly optimistic figure. And with what we have now, with the current debate we are seeing over what the PIB now, over what should go to the host communities, there's every likelihood that if it's not handled very well, we might see some kind of crisis erupt in the Niger Delta. We know Avengers had actually given the government a deadline to address some of its own demands. So it's difficult to see how the government can actually accomplish 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. It's just not possible. It's just a projection. It's a projection, Ramah, and it's usually what the government does. But deep down, everyone knows there's just no way the country would be able to do that. There's a chance it could do it, but then with the OPEC quota now you have in place, it is difficult to see how that will happen.
Okay, one last question for you, Deji, and this one's away from oil issues. I understand the Federal Inland Revenue Service has slapped MultiChoice with it's a $4.4 billion tax claim, pretty large. It's twice as large as what the tax claim was on MTN some years ago. What more do we know about this demand?
Well, essentially, what this whole thing is about is that the FIRS, that's the Federal Inland Revenue Service, is accusing MTN of under remittance of tax, so to speak, and it says it actually wrote to MTN. Yeah, exactly. So that it actually wrote to MTN seeking to investigate its books and all of that, but that MTN would not allow that MTN was just hesitant and not cooperative at all, that it had done everything to open talks with MTN, that it has discovered, for instance, that MTN's parent company, that's, sorry, I said MTN, MultiChoice, I should say, sorry, Ramah, that MultiChoice parent company now, that's MultiChoice Africa, has actually not paid VAT now since inception, and that's a very, very serious allegation. But let me just say this: MultiChoice has come out to say that is actually not the case, that they've been very cooperative at all times, and that their tax book is actually up to date. But of course, the FIRS is insisting. The FIRS has now asked the banks where MultiChoice has accounts to freeze these accounts and make move now to recover this money. And we're talking about something in the region of $4.4 billion. That's a huge amount of money, far higher than what MTN was asked to pay back in 2018. Of course, that was resolved. So, well, the good thing is that MultiChoice has come out to say that it is open to talks with the FIRS. So I believe at some point there would be some kind of settlement, there would be some kind of meeting, and we can't also rule out the possibility that this might also go to court, as we saw in the case of MTN in 2018 before it was eventually settled. But obviously the FIRS says it is serious and that it wants MultiChoice to pay this amount of money, $4.4 billion, Ramah. It's a huge amount of money, and well, I think we might have the storm before we have the calm. We just have to wait and see how this pans out.
Indeed. The markets, of course, in South Africa are not exactly liking that news. MultiChoice shares falling by at least 7% in today's trading session. We'll leave it there for the time being. Deji Badmus there live in Lagos. Lagos, of course, is still part of our next story. The country is the commercial centre of Nigeria, but it dropped 22 places to rank 93rd in the 2021 Global Fintech rankings. Now, while Lagos did fall in the report, Kenya's capital, Nairobi, went up 26 places to 37th. According to the report, it's the only African city in the top 50 category of cities around the world. Accra, Ghana's capital, fell 28 places to rank 151st in the global ranking of cities. Within the year, over 50 new cities and 20 new countries were added to that index, meaning that they host the headquarters of at least 10 privately owned fintech companies. Among the 83 countries in the index, Nigeria dropped 5 places to rank 57th behind Kenya, which moved 11 places up to 31st. Africa's largest economy also ranked behind South Africa. South Africa dropped 7 places to rank 44th. Zimbabwe Central Bank has released a new 50 Zimbabwean dollar note into circulation. That's the highest denomination for this recently reintroduced currency, and it aims to ease transactions in an economy that has been struggling for quite a while now with triple-digit inflation. CGTN's Farai Mokutuya has the details from Harare.
People are yet to see the new banknotes, but aren't short of opinion on how they will impact them. The central bank says the $50 note will enhance transaction convenience. However, some are concerned the new tender could have unintended consequences.
Transport fares were recently raised to $120, but I foresee them going up to $150 now, so that there are no challenges of change.
We used to have coins and 2 $5 notes, but they're no longer in circulation since higher denominations were introduced. So this $50 note simply means the phasing out of the $10 note.
But analysts have downplayed the fears.
Our economy has been very speculative, and we have got some rent seekers and arbitrary goers in our economy. The expectation is always that prices are going to go up, which I think from the measures that have been put up by Reserve Bank, we don't expect any increase in the prices. And even the functionality of the auction system, I think, will also help defend any price increase because it becomes unreasonable.
The central bank has punished companies that get money on the foreign currency auction at the official rate but price their goods using the parallel market rate. It's also adjusted its quarterly reserve money growth targets from 22.5% to 20% in order to maintain a downward trajectory on inflation.
Even at the target of 22.5% reserve money growth, we are significantly lower in the first quarter of 2021. At a time we expected the reserve money growth was going to be higher. We have done significantly well to contain it in the regions of around 10%.
Analysts expect the monetary expansion to be held below the new target in the next quarter, which will help bring inflation down to the year-end target of 25%. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Approaching 15 minutes into the hour, let's run through some company news. Starting in Uganda, the insurance group Jubilee Holdings has invested an extra $40.7 million in Uganda's Bujagali hydroelectric power plant. And the investment now raises its stake in the project to just under 41%, at least in the year ending in December. The Nairobi Securities Exchange listed company previously held a quarter of the power plant equity stake, which supplies half of Uganda's effective generation capacity. A 1,174-carat diamond has been unearthed in Botswana. It's the second unveiling of a massive diamond discovery in the country in a month. The latest find basically would fill the palm of a large hand. It was discovered in June on the 12th. It was found by the Canadian diamond firm Lucara and presented to the country's cabinet in Havana on Wednesday. Botswana leads the world for the largest precious stones. It accounts for 6 of the top 10 lists. The country is Africa's leading diamond producer. And DP World plans to buy the South African Imperial Logistics Group for $819 million in what the port operator says would be its most significant acquisition in Africa thus far. The deal is expected to close by the first quarter of 2022. The privately held company offered $4.60 a share. That's a 40% premium to Imperial's last close. The shares surged by as much as 36% on Thursday. They were trading just below the offer price. And further afield, the EU has fined Volkswagen and BMW $1 billion after it found that the German car makers colluded with another rival, Mercedes-Benz owner Daimler, to delay emissions cleaning tech. Now, under the terms of the settlement, Volkswagen, the world's largest manufacturer of cars, will pay a fine of $595 million. BMW will fork out $442 million. Daimler, also part of the cartel, was not fined because it revealed the existence of this collusion. That's the run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll head over to Ethiopia and explore that country's efforts to restructure at least $1 billion of debt. And Ghana is trying to woo the diaspora community and other African nationals to invest in the country.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay, we'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Ethiopia. The government over there has started the process of restructuring an additional $1 billion of public debt as it seeks to free up more funds to support its economic recovery amidst this global COVID-19 pandemic. The restructuring plan, however, does not cover Eurobonds. The Finance Ministry says the restructuring will provide a grace period of roughly 6 years and extend the maturity by 10 years. At the moment, roughly $2.5 billion in principal and interest payments have been postponed for 5 years by commercial creditors under the first external debt restructuring scheme. This announcement comes after Ethiopia requested to rework its debt under the G20 common framework. All right, then let's explore this in a bit more detail with Zemedene Negatu, who joins us now from the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. Zemedene, good to see you on the program. So, Ethiopia has made this request, though, to the G20 and to the Paris Club to restructure its debt as far back as February, but we still don't have a creditor committee set up yet. The IMF, in fact, was speaking about that this week. Why has that happened?
Well, Rob, it's good to be back on your program again. Thank you. As you indicated, Ethiopia has been working on debt restructuring, partly with the DSSI program, but also reprofiling with the IMF, and it's been ongoing for the last couple of 3-4 months. It sounds like they're making progress, but as you indicated, the IMF is also putting in its effort to expedite the process. But for me, the key point is that they've actually made very significant progress since they started this process. As you indicated in your intro, they started with a target of $4 billion, of which $2.5 billion has already been restructured, extended, the repayment period has been extended, and the interest rates also have been renegotiated. So yes, this process started, as you said, in February, but for me, the result of what they've already achieved is actually a very good indicator that they're on track. Perhaps with the establishment of this creditors committee, it probably could be accelerated as well. But also in your intro, you indicated that they're now focusing on the next $1 billion. Of course, it doesn't include the Eurobond, but to me, very frankly speaking, the Eurobond I don't think is a very significant component. It's only $1 billion, and the coupon rate, if you just clip it and pay it this year, is around $66 million. So it's not a very significant amount. But anyways, to re-emphasize what the Finance Ministry said, at the moment, that is not on the table. They're just looking at bilateral, multilaterals, and the billion is in addition to the $2.5 billion that they've already restructured. This is based on the public information that they've already disseminated this week.
Right. So just to be clear, to give us a sense of context that we have here, what Ethiopia is trying to deal with is mostly a short-term liquidity issue, as opposed to, the economy is messed up, we really can't pay any of our debts. It's a liquidity squeeze that needs to be attended to, right?
Exactly. I mean, the economy actually has done fairly well. I mean, despite COVID, and as you know, Africa as a whole last year had a negative GDP growth, Ethiopia was one of the very few countries which actually grew, according to the government, last year 6.1%. In the fiscal year that just closed this week, the forecast is 8.5%. So you're absolutely right. It's just to address the short-term liquidity, because the fundamentals, the long-term fundamentals of the Ethiopian economy are still attractive. There are some macro challenges which they're trying to address, like, for example, inflation. But overall, I mean, I'll give you an example. Exports, again, despite COVID, despite the whole world being shut down last year, exports for the first time in several years increased by 19%. It's a record $3.5 billion. Yes, granted, on $107 billion GDP, it could do better. But remember, in context, it's a record export. So the answer to your question is they're trying to address the liquidity, but the long-term fundamentals are still attractive.
Okay, so Ethiopia did get DSSI relief from at least 5 members, I believe, of the Paris Club. Right. But where does that leave debt due to China? Has any of that been restructured? Is there work going on around that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, at least from what we've heard from people in Washington and other places, actually China has signed up to be part of the DSSI. I'm not quite sure if it's actually gone all the way to finalize the process. I know the U.S. government has put out a statement, I think this week, saying they would like the Chinese to expedite their engagement in this process. But it sounds like at least they're on board. Initially, there was some reluctance, I think, by the Chinese. They wanted their debt, not just in Ethiopia, by the way, throughout Africa, and all the debt that they provided across Africa, they wanted to be treated as bilateral and not part of the Paris Club, not part of the DSSI. But the good news is they've joined it. It's just that, as I said, there are some indications that others are pressuring or indicating to the Chinese to expedite the process. And that's apparently where this process is at.
Okay, so looking at the currency side of it, I mean, looking at the graph of the Ethiopian birr, at least that we see it on the interbank market, over the last 5 years, the birr has gone down by nearly 100%. It's 13.5% weaker to the dollar in the interbank market so far in 2021. Reserves are falling as well. What's the currency reform plan that we're looking at?
Right, again, a very good question. Actually, the government has signed up with the IMF to have a flexible market-determined exchange rate. In the past, if you look at the last 15 years or so, it was a very rigid, not always realistic reflection. It was depreciating by 5, maybe 6% per year, when the actual real rate was higher than that, as measured by the parallel market. So as part of the move in the next 2, because there's a lot of reforms in the financial service sector. So as part of the reforms, what the government has decided, I think in partnership with the IMF, is to move towards a market-driven exchange rate. And that's why what this is now reflecting is the market ultimately will say what the exchange rate will be, and the government has accepted to that approach, as opposed to what it used to be in the past, which was not realistic. So that's part of the reason. But as I said, as I indicated earlier, though, you talked about the reserves, but if Ethiopia continues to increase its forex generation, primarily from export, then I think the reserve will hopefully continue to increase. But remember the context we're talking now. Last year was the worst year for the global economy, including Africa, in a century or more. So despite all that, frankly speaking, to increase export by 3.5%, by 18% to 3.5 billion, and curtailing as much as possible imports and expanding local production. It's not there yet, but they're working on that. When you take all these factors together, I think the reserve hopefully will continue to increase, but you need to take the global context of what the whole world was operating in. And in that context, I would say they've done fairly well.
Okay, one last question for you. This is slightly unfair because I know you don't work for Ethiopian Airlines, but some of these debts that Ethiopia has, some of them are linked, of course, to state-owned entities. And last May, Ethiopian Airlines said, look, we're fine, we'll manage, we're not going to we'll keep servicing our debts, and we're not going to be seeking state support. Is that still the case?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you asked me this question, because just to give you context, if I'm not mistaken, Ethiopian Airlines was the only airline in the world to have made profit last year. And it was, if not the only one of the very few airlines in the world that did not get a bailout. It continued to service its debt last year, even at the depth of the pandemic, and is actually now back on strong financial footing. So they continue to, their credit rating is still as good as it was pre-COVID. And from everything I've heard, they are continuing to service the debt on time. They did not need a bailout. They're using their own cash flow. So in that regard, I think it's a shining example for Africa, actually, that it's some of these multinationals like Ethiopia have weathered the turmoil, the COVID turmoil that occurred last year.
And that cost control that we always talk about with Ethiopian Airlines, that's really coming into play at this point, isn't it?
Exactly. And the rejigging of their fleet from an all passage to add a lot more cargo capacity when there was no passenger last year anywhere in the world, that also helped them. So they were very nimble, even though they're a very large airline of 130 aircrafts for $4.2 billion in revenue, 17,000 employees. The cost cutting, as well as the repositioning of their fleet and their strategy on how to survive, actually should be a lesson, probably something to be taught in the Harvard Business School or some of these top business schools, how African companies actually manage to wither. Not many, but there are shining examples like Ethiopian Airlines.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Zamadin Nagatu, thank you very much. Always fun having you on the program tonight. Now then, let's focus on East Africa. Countries in the East African community, members of that particular trade bloc, that benefited from the bloc's adoption of a common market roughly a decade ago. And that has made it far, far easier to transfer goods right across the bloc. Despite the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, regional trade flows have remained pretty vibrant compared to other parts of the continent. CGTN's Nick Modimba has that story.
Namanga, Kenya's border with Tanzania. Business is on as usual. The tough COVID-19 times have changed how operations are conducted at the border. trucks from Tanzania in a rush to deliver different foodstuffs at the biggest wholesale market in East Africa. A long journey for most drivers as the border clearance awaits.
Clearance is very seamless. It's good that these countries come together. We hope that soon we will just be using IDs and parts to the other countries. Another good thing is that business is currently going on and everyone benefits. The traders benefit, the drivers benefit, and truck owners also get something.
It's 4 a.m. and the Marikiti market in Kenya's capital Nairobi is full of life. This is where goods from East African countries are brought for sale to traders and wholesalers. And in the cover of darkness, operations are going on as usual. Trucks from Uganda, Tanzania and other East African countries are all here. The traders on the ground bracing the early morning cold with a hot cup of coffee to keep them going. Fresh goods like pineapples, carrots, onions and other foodstuffs, all from different East African countries and within Kenya, all ready for supply. But for the traders, it has been a tedious journey and the pandemic hasn't made things any better.
At the moment, as much as things are different compared to old days, the coronavirus pandemic slowed things down. At times, goods reach the border and there is traffic jam. If there is jam, the goods will arrive late.
By the time the sun rises, the market is going through final stages of the day's activity. Most of the goods are already en route to specific retail and consumer destinations. The ease of doing business and the pillars of the East African community conspicuously manifesting in this market, unity in diversity.
I am from Uganda and I work here in Nairobi. The East African community idea has helped us a lot because we are now one. Some time back, we used to have a difficult time, but these days, the border is open and there's ease of doing business.
We get our oranges from Tanga in Tanzania. These days, things are easier to move around the border, and these perishable goods don't go stale. Compared to previous years, it was very difficult. At the moment, clearance is very fast. The vehicles come in early in the market, which keeps the supply chain consistent.
The objectives of the EAC Customs Union include furthering the liberalization of intra-regional trade in goods, promoting production efficiency in the community, enhancing domestic, cross-border and foreign investment, and promoting economic development and industrial diversification. The reduction of red tapes and embargoes in doing business among the countries is actually a welcome move by so many traders and drivers. Right now, the only issue they're facing is the issue of vaccination and, of course, COVID-19 test results turnaround, which is affecting the perishable movable goods to the market. Nick Mudimba, CGTN at the Marikiti Market, Nairobi, Kenya.
And trade experts in Uganda urging regional leaders to harmonize their agricultural standards in order to boost trade flow across the region. Uganda has a massive surplus of agricultural produce, but exporting it into other countries is still a challenge, mostly because of differences in sanitary and phytosanitary standards set by some of its neighbors. Here's CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga with this report.
A bumper harvest in Uganda. These women are sorting cereals for the market, but supply is outstripping local demand. And the Ugandan president is concerned about crops going to waste.
Uganda now is a country of surpluses. Maize, where we produce 5 million tons per year, but consume only 1 million tons within Uganda. Milk, we produce 2.6 billion liters, but consume only 800 million liters.
And more produce is still coming into the market. Figures from Uganda's Bureau of Statistics show that 70% of Ugandans are involved in agriculture. Local authorities are urging farmers to produce more so that they can improve on their incomes. There are hopes that the surplus could be exported to other countries in the region. But ensuring all standards in all countries are met is still a challenge.
Products like maize sometimes get affected, get contaminated during transportation. Even when they meet standards at farm level and at packaging level, they sometimes get contaminated during transportation or even during storage. as the trucks are waiting to be cleared on the border. That's where if you have a standards infrastructure across the border points.
Uganda recently had a standoff with her neighbor Kenya over the quality of maize imports. Kenya has since put in place tough conditions such as registration of cereal importers, certificate of conformity on aflatoxin levels, and details of warehouses. President Yoweri Museveni also wants African leaders to speed up the integration of markets on the continent.
We need to deal, along with our brothers and sisters in Africa, with three issues: regional and continental integration, to unite the regional and continental markets, to support production of goods and services better. Higher purchasing power in Uganda so that Ugandans can buy more. This is the answer for the markets. Number three, and good quality products at comparative cost that can be accepted in national, regional, continental, and international markets.
Uganda has also decided to strengthen quality checks at all levels of production. But for now, to keep in business, these traders are processing the produce into long shelf life products as they wait for new markets. Hilary Isga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
In West Africa, Ghana is turning to its citizens in the diaspora and those of African descent around the world for investments and trade. It's part of a 10-year plan that's aimed at boosting the country's economic growth over the medium term. The government hopes that this will also help the country to quickly recover from all the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Born in America, Robert Bott now calls Ghana home. He retired from the U.S. Marine and moved to Ghana to set up this security company 5 years ago. He has created jobs for 450 people.
I noticed that there was an overall lack of training and the attitude and the professionalism was missing. So with my background, I thought that I can infuse more professionalism and just an attitude of being better.
More than 3 million Ghanaians live in the USA, the Caribbean, and Europe. The government wants to attract those living in the diaspora and people of African descent, like Bott, to support Ghana's economic growth.
There's opportunity in agricultural production, there's opportunity in agro-processing, even infrastructure. We've had quite a number of significant people in the diaspora come and says, okay, maybe we don't have the money to build the infrastructure, but we can add our brains, our skills to ensuring that Ghana gets value for money. We have a mechanism where we're also getting many of them to join us in government in policy formulation and all that.
Last year, the government launched a 10-year plan aimed at engaging Africans in the diaspora to invest in Ghana. Part of the campaign is to raise $3 billion through loans and remittances to support the economy. The government also wants people in the diaspora to come to Ghana to set up businesses and has established a diaspora investment desk to oversee this. Still, Bott says more needs to be done.
The message that's being presented to globally about Ghana is come back to Ghana and you can get citizenship. But when they get here, that path or that easy transition is not there.
In 2019, Ghana granted citizenship to more than 100 African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans as part of its Year of Return campaign. The government says it wants to also reform regulations to improve the ease of doing business. Ghana is already receiving huge remittances from people living abroad as it looks to attract diaspora investments. Last year, the World Bank estimated that the country's remittances shot up by 5% to $3.6 billion, despite the economic disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Analysts want the government to now find ways of making it easy for people in the diaspora to open their own bank accounts in Ghana. They say this could boost foreign exchange inflows.
It's a broader conversation that should happen, that the government focus is to see how these financial service players, in fact the people in the private sector, can be able to attract more savings or investment from people in the diaspora. And I think technology will be at the center of it.
look good, smell good, know your job. When I first
Having found a stable place in Ghana for his business, Robert Bott wants people in the diaspora to consider the West African country as a destination for trade and investments. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Good morning, everybody.
You're still watching Global Business Africa. Plenty more content coming up, including this. China pledges to increase financial support to small and medium-sized enterprises. And we'll explore why businesses are struggling to fill job openings even as pandemic restrictions are lifted in the United States.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's make a quick run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in the world of healthcare, more and more countries across the continent are reporting cases of the Delta coronavirus variant. Now, it was originally identified in India. According to the African Centers for Disease Control, Malawi and Senegal are the latest to confirm COVID cases with the Delta variant involved. There are now 15 countries across the region that have reported the presence of the Delta variant. In the meantime, the continent as a whole has reported over 250,000 new cases of COVID-19 in the last 2 weeks. Elsewhere, police officers in the Democratic Republic of Congo have arrested a leader of a militia group in the eastern end of the country. Kambale Kabamba was arrested in the city of Oicha on Wednesday. Fighters of his Mai Mai militia accused of carrying out some pretty deadly attacks in the eastern end of the DRC. And thousands of internally displaced persons from Niger have started to return to their homes in the Difa region in the eastern end of the country. Many of them had fled their homes 6 years ago due to attacks by militant group Boko Haram. The repatriation operation is being carried out under the supervision of the country's authorities and the army as well. That's a run through your headlines. Away from the continent now, China says it will increase financial support available for firms with a keen focus on micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. That was announced at a State Council executive meeting chaired by the Premier, Li Keqiang, on the 7th of July. The country will use a range of monetary tools, including cuts in the reserve requirement ratio for banks at appropriate times in order to partially mitigate the impact of commodity price hikes in company operations. Now, China also plans to launch trials of a national trading system for carbon emission rights among power generation companies later this month. And we're still in the world's second largest economy. Financial institutions in China do continue to cut service fees for enterprises. That's also part of the government's efforts there to ease the financial burden the firms are facing amidst this pandemic. To date, over 3.3 billion vaccine doses have been administered worldwide, but over 4 million people have died of COVID-19 by the 8th of July.
The policies to cut fees cover 5 major areas, including bank account services, renminbi transactions, and electronic banking. For example, charges for intercity cash withdrawals at automated teller machines, or ATMs, will be lowered to less than 3.5 yuan per transaction. The extra fees for cross-city transactions are done away with. Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, Fan Yifei, says the country's institutions must comply with the full delivery of these policies.
Financial institutions should not raise fees before cutting them. We should have 2 systems, one for the banks and one for the payment institutions, to ensure the implementation of these fee cuts. We should also identify small and micro-sized businesses properly and efficiently. Meanwhile, it's necessary to strengthen the interpretation and promotion for these policies. State-owned banks should play the leading role to supervise.
The Deputy Governor says those expected to benefit the most from these policies are small and micro-sized enterprises and self-employed people. They are expected to save some 16 billion yuan, or around 70% of the total fee cuts. In total, around 24 billion yuan in fees are expected to be reduced for market entities and ordinary citizens each year. Another surplus of the transaction fee cuts is that it increases the disposable income of citizens, and that boosts spending in the country.
With the increase in people's disposable income, Chinese people's consumption patterns and price elasticity have also been improved. During the May Day holiday, payments reached 7 trillion yuan, mainly in sectors including tourism, catering, and entertainment. That's a 32% increase year-on-year, and a 70% drop compared with figures in 2019 before the pandemic.
Last year, many enterprises, especially those smaller ones, were hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Financial institutions have been helping them recover. Official data shows the banking sector has cut 1.5 trillion yuan, or around $200 billion for the real economy. Zhu Zhu, CGTN, Beijing.
All right, then let's cross the pond, across the Pacific, and go over to the United States. Businesses across the U.S. are on a hiring spree as pandemic restrictions do continue to ease and the economic recovery there gathers pace. Job openings are at record levels, but many an employer is struggling to find people to fill those openings. Infection rates may be dropping, but the pandemic continues to loom large over the country's labor market. Here's William Denslow with this report from New York.
Vivian Forte has been the owner of this restaurant on Manhattan's Upper West Side for 18 years. But this is a shift like no other.
I've never served a table before in my life, whereas today me and my manager served the entire restaurant, all 160 seats.
Before the pandemic, Forte could find last-minute staffing cover if someone called in sick. But now it's a struggle.
Most of the people who work for me are in the arts, and they're just quite simply not in New York City. They won't come back until the industry is thriving. The fact that Broadway is opening here or a couple comedy clubs are opening there doesn't matter. It's a highly competitive city, and until there really is a baseline of artistic activity again, the people who really fuel my business, they're just not going to return.
Without the hiring depth available, Festicci is now no longer requiring 2 or 3 years of prior restaurant experience.
Employers across the city are reporting similar hiring challenges. According to a recent Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce survey, more than half of businesses in that borough said they were struggling to fill their staffing needs.
There are now more than 9 million job openings in the US, a record high. But the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, says the COVID-19 pandemic is largely to blame. He says health concerns and unemployment benefits are contributing factors. Childcare and remote schooling is also seen as a barrier for many to re-enter the workforce.
If you think about the childcare situation, that's already accounting for a lot of people who cannot work because they have to take care of their children.
New York City's unemployment rate in April stood at over 11%. That's nearly double the national average. Jobs may be coming back, but economists warn it can take time to fill positions, especially after such a tumultuous year.
They're basically asking, workers who have led their lives differently over the past year to drop everything and run back to the office or the business or whatever. Give me a break. It's like, life doesn't work that way.
New York has rolled back most of its COVID-19 restrictions, and diners are returning en masse to the city's restaurants. But with tourism, hospitality and the arts yet to fully recover, it could take time before the labour market truly starts firing again. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Now, the Biden administration has proposed spending over $170 billion in order to boost the electric car market and induce tens of millions of buyers to move away from gas-powered cars. But the question still remains, will this policy package do enough to spur US drivers to drop the roar of supercharged fossil-fueled V8s for the eco-friendly, whisper-quiet performance of electric cars? Mark New finds out on What's Hot tonight.
According to ChargePoint, a leader in providing EV charging networks in North America and Europe, moving to electric requires a change in mindset.
So I think the biggest one is this expectation that I'm going to charge the vehicle the way that I drive to a gas station and fill up from empty. That's not what the use case is. It's very much like your cell phone. You look in the ChargePoint map and you'll see that chargers are in all these places that you didn't really expect. In your local library, your local parking garage, at your workplace, at your favorite restaurant.
There are currently more than 136,400 gas stations in the United States. Compare that to public EV charging stations, which number just over 43,000. But the Biden administration is pledging to have more than 500,000 of those devices installed across the United States by 2030.
We're really excited about everyone's attention to the EV charging space, and this is very much a cross-industry solution to move to electric vehicle charging. So you see very active participation with the automotive industry, very essential collaboration with government, essential collaboration with utilities.
The Biden administration has rolled out a $174 billion plan that would boost domestic supplies for EV infrastructure and provide tax incentives for consumer adoption. But a Republican counteroffer would trim EV infrastructure spending to just $4 billion.
A lot of people think like, oh my God, 170 billion, that's a lot of money. And it is. But if you think about the automotive industry being a $3 trillion industry a year, if you think about sales, service, everything that's associated with automobiles, it's not really very much at all. I compare it almost to like the invention of the automobile. Back then we didn't have asphalt, right? We didn't have streets, we didn't have highways. You had to build those. Private companies can't pay for this themselves. That's something where governments have to get involved in.
Kozlowski says American innovation has been at the forefront of the EV industry, pointing out how Tesla has built its own charging network. But he says overall the U.S. has fallen behind.
We see that European customers and Chinese customers are even more interested in buying electric vehicles. And a lot of that has to do with incentive programs by governments around the world. There are also very strong commitments by regional governments in Europe, for example, that are saying clearly that by the end of this decade, maybe even sooner than that, they will actually ban the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles.
University of Berkeley professor James Sallee calls the Biden EV plan reasonably aggressive, but says charging station speed and location are also key.
It's pretty easy to install ineffective chargers by putting them in undesirable locations. And so here I think is some of the challenges is thinking about how to leverage public-private partnerships and how to actually get chargers to be in the place where you want them.
Sallee says California has been able to reduce overall carbon emissions, but that emissions from the transportation sector continue to rise.
Transportation emissions keep climbing. But if we can shrink that role, then we can, I think, this is the biggest bite out of the climate apple that we can probably take in the next decade.
Sallee says it will take creativity to convince some skeptics to convert to EVs. But companies like ChargePoint believe as more and more consumers give them a spin, both the economic benefits and the driving experience will keep them away from gas for good. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
At a time when Stellantis is having their EV day, it feels a little weird to be talking about Brent crude and fossil fuels. But let's dive into that. Brent is our starting point, right, as far as commodities are concerned. Down 2.4% so far this week after that rather dramatic falling out between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But the prices have gotten a bit of a slight impetus to turn around today. Brent was about 0.8% higher at 16.25 GMT. The latest data from the IEA pointing to growing demand for fuel, even as inventories in the US continue to fall for the 7th week in a row. Spot gold prices are down by around 5.25% so far this year. Here's what's coming up next. After years of turmoil, night businesses are showing up once again in Somalia's capital. Welcome back. An entrepreneur in the Somali capital, Mogadishu, is turning into a household name by providing restaurant services late into the night. You see, for years now, actually a better part of a decade plus, the city was deemed to be a no-go zone for residents. But businesses are now flourishing after years of civil unrest. CGTN's Tulisha Balala has this entrepreneur's story on Grassroots.
Rakia Mohammed Ali is one of the business owners in the Horn of Africa who turned risks into profit following years of unrest in the country. Located along Mogadishu's Maka Al Mukarrama Street, her restaurant, Late Night, is now a preferred destination.
Security is the baseline to every positive change you may see. Barely 10 years ago, there were different armed forces that manned checkpoints within the city. The rival armed groups at illegal checkpoints discouraged investments in business. It has been a challenge to operate businesses like this, which we see in Mogadishu during the night today.
Rakia embarked on this business 2 years ago. She envisioned an opportunity to serve the growing number of people under the most challenging environmental conditions.
We felt there's a need to open business that is open during the night. For example, most restaurants in Mogadishu were only open during the day or maybe until early hours of the night. We thought our youth need some place to pass time. We then established this modern business to cover the need. It is now possible for them to stay or come here any time of the night.
When we compare between the day and the night, it is safer to go out during the night. You can walk to anywhere you want. The environment is conducive. Some restaurants only open in the afternoon and operate at night. People hang out in these restaurants at night. They stay there until midnight.
Somalia's armed conflict has been characterized by extremism and sectarian political violence. Women are disproportionately at risk of death and are targets of sexual and gender-based violence. This, however, doesn't deter some of Rakia's regular customers.
I feel so much at peace. A few years back, it was not possible to come out at night due to insecurity. You could be at the mercy of armed gangs. No one was comfortable to come out and take tea or speak with friends during the night. Now the situation is so different. You may come out, decide to sleep on the first half of the night, and go out to sit at your favorite places late at night.
Analysts believe that the recent stability has encouraged ventures into new and modern businesses in the Somali capital. This, in turn, has been forecasted to provide more employment opportunities and improve incomes. For Rakia, she is hopeful that the city will gradually be restored to its former glory and the recent fragile peace will further be fulfilled in the coming years. Noktula Shabalala, CGTN.
All right, then a quick update on the currencies. We did speak briefly about the Ethiopian birr in the last 30 minutes or so. It's steadily giving ground to the US dollar so far in 2021, down 13% to around 43.93 today. Yields on the country's 2024 Eurobond did jump up by 30 basis points. That's the most in 7 weeks, according to Bloomberg data. Kenya did hold its weekly auction for short-term debt today, getting 146% of the $222 million it was looking to raise in bids. The bulk of demand, however, went to the shorter end of the range, the 91 and the 182-day T-bills. The interest rate gap between the 182-day note and the 364-day one is pretty tiny. It's around 40 basis points, so that partly explains that demand shift. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.